Hi, I'm Tim Travis of Xbox Reviews and Verdicts, and today I'm reviewing Dead Space 3 from EA and Visceral Games. The Dead Space series is without a doubt the premier survival horror franchise of this generation. Visceral has stepped into the horror spotlight admirably by creating a well-realized universe, chilling atmosphere, and some truly ghastly creatures. Sure, Dead Space 2 had a completely unnecessary competitive multiplayer mode, but it's hard to argue with what's possibly the most intense single-player game of this generation. But can Visceral end the trilogy on a high note? So it's the verdict on Dead Space 3. Let's find out. Like the previous games, Dead Space 3 doesn't wait much time getting into the action. After a brief prologue, we find Isaac Clarke confronted in his apartment by two EarthGov soldiers who need Isaac for a mission, presumably to destroy more markers. Isaac has a personal stake in this as fellow survivor of the Titan Station incident and ex-girlfriend Ellie Langford is missing on the job. It's not long until Unitologist soldiers attack the lunar colony, and Isaac grudgingly accepts the mission and joins a ragtag team dedicated to ending the marker and necromorph threat. Seeing as EarthGov is otherwise gone, there's no one else to do the job. Dead Space 3's story is pretty straightforward and easy to understand, but it's not without fault. A small complaint is directed towards the Unitologist soldiers. It's a little jarring that Unitology is presented as a terrorist organization, seeing as the religion wasn't portrayed this harshly in previous games. The bigger complaint is with the characters. There's nothing terribly interesting about them. The writing isn't particularly exciting for a game about ending the necromorph threat. A plot twist can be seen coming from a mile away, and quite frankly, I preferred Isaac when he was going insane. If you've played a Dead Space game before, you know what you're getting into in terms of gameplay. Not much has changed since Dead Space 2. It's still a solid third-person shooter with twists like the ability to slow down enemies using stasis, toss objects around using kinesis, and inventory management doesn't pause the action. Necromorphs are as unsettling as ever and can only be taken down by shooting their limbs off. It's still just a matter of aiming for the arms and legs instead of the head. From the perspective of combat, there are a few additions. You now have the ability to do a combat roll, but it's something you might not even use at all. There's also the ability to duck behind cover, but it only comes into play when fighting Unitologist soldiers, which is infrequent. Whereas the gameplay is familiar, the feature set has seen a fairly dramatic change. While multiplayer isn't new to the series, this is the first Dead Space game to feature a cooperative mode. To be clear, when played alone, you don't have an AI buddy along for the ride, but you can play the entire game with a partner who plays as John Carver. There are some things that change with the addition of co-op besides having a buddy to help in combat. Puzzles will be tailored to fit the addition of a second player, but more importantly, there are extra missions that only appear when played in co-op. In the 3 co-op exclusive missions, Carver is in a similar position Isaac was in Dead Space 2. He's haunted by his past and experiencing some weird visions. It's a neat touch that the person playing as Carver will see things Isaac doesn't, but this story element feels a bit forced since it only appears in the cooperative missions instead of being seamlessly integrated into the main story, and the promised changes to the narrative with a buddy around are far too minimal. And couch co-op fans should also keep in mind Dead Space 3 does not feature a split screen mode. The other series first is weapon crafting, which fundamentally changes the game's economy. You no longer buy additional armaments such as the line gun from a store, you have to create the line gun, or just about anything you can think of. While you come across very few crafting materials in the first few hours, once you get to the surface of Tau Volantis, the game gives you a ton of parts to play with. The system is very user-friendly. First you choose whether you want a one- or two-handed weapon, what kind of primary or secondary firing modes you want, tooltips that alter how your weapons fire, and attachments that further modify the weapon's behavior. It's a system that's fun to experiment with. Want a single-handed flamethrower with an underbarrel knife to help slash your way through enemies? Maybe a ripper blade with a rotator cuff to function like a plasma cutter? Or how about a burst-fire submachine gun and force gun combo? The choice is yours. It feels like a logical step forward for the series, but you'll have to do some experimenting to find what works best for you. However, in previous games, you needed to hoard a ton of power nodes to fully upgrade your weapons. That's done away with the addition of upgrade circuits. By the time you complete the game, you have upgrades that are so good you won't need to further upgrade much in New Game Plus since your weapons are already so powerful, which diminishes the replayability a bit. A necessary evil to accommodate for the sheer amount of options is that ammo is now universal, which makes inventory management less necessary and the game is somewhat easier for it. However, while the addition of weapon crafting and ousting the competitive modes in favor of co-op are logical steps forward for the series, Dead Space 3 otherwise feels underwhelming. Dead Space 2 was arguably the ultimate example of a linear action game. Its story barreled forward at an unrelenting pace and took you to locations that were consistently interesting. The game was a roller coaster, a violent, bloody, horrifying roller coaster. The pacing of Dead Space 3 is sluggish by comparison. In Dead Space 2, you were always seeing something new. Here you spend way too much time in each environment. Much of the early levels take place in space and in derelict starships. These early sections became very grating, and all I wanted after a few hours was to see something different. This isn't helped by numerous odd design choices. The game is artificially lengthened by backtracking, puzzles, and optional side objectives. The story has a difficult time moving forward, whereas Dead Space 2 had a great sense of forward momentum. There are even more things about Dead Space 3 that don't play to the series' strengths. The combat is far less interesting than it has been. The normal difficulty is far too easy, and you are given so many resources, whether by finding them scattered around the world or using scavenger bots, that combat almost feels like it plays itself, and the way the game dishes out enemies is far less surprising and relentless than past games. The Dead Space series is responsible for revitalizing horror games. I can return to the first two games time and again, yet still be disturbed by them. I cranked the volume and dimmed the lights for Dead Space 3, and I can't remember jumping from my seat or simply being terrified once. It feels like it was made by a different developer in this regard. There's very little tension, and not because of a focus on action-packed set pieces. There's very little of that either. Dead Space 3 is a much longer game than Dead Space 2, and my first playthrough lasted almost 14 hours. There's a lot to do here, but a heavy amount of backtracking, unnecessary side missions, combat that feels timid by comparison to past games, and an unexciting story make the overall length of the game feel bloated. The game gets better as it goes, but it's a far cry from its stalwart predecessor. At least the production values are up to the series standards. The graphical quality is excellent, and the vast landscape of Tau Volantis is only matched by the expansiveness of space. The lack of a traditional heads-up display is still immersive, and the fact that your helmet casts light on the environment is a nice touch. The outdoor areas are cool, but Visceral Games was clearly better at the environments they made in the first two games. The Ishimura was dark and creepy, and the colony of Titan Station was once lively and exciting, making the Necromorph attack all the more unsettling. These were places I wanted to explore. I can't say the same for these derelict ships and abandoned outposts. It's a nice touch that the Necromorphs have been reimagined. Seeing that the bodies have been dead for 200 years, the Necromorphs have an almost mummified look to them, which is a creepy concept, but it doesn't matter much if what they're doing isn't consistently disturbing. The music is solid and the sound design for the Necromorphs won't disappoint fans, but these elements along with the ambience don't do much to heighten scares or tension, because there isn't any. Visceral made some logical decisions for Dead Space 3. Weapon crafting makes sense for the series, some story elements reasonably end the trilogy, and if EA is going to insist on implementing some form of multiplayer in all of their major franchises, this is a great way to go about it. But the game that surrounds these good decisions does not play to the series' greatest strengths: intense combat, unsettling atmosphere, and a sheer sense of terror. Dead Space fans will find a fun enough game here, and the character building, co-op, and side missions warrant some replay, but be ready to lower your expectations from the lofty standards of the series. Oops. Thanks for watching this review. Please subscribe to the channel, and I hope you enjoy my future videos.